April 30th, 1945, 3:25 p.m., Berlin. Beneath the broken streets of a city that no longer resembled a capital but a corpse, the air inside the Führer bunker was thick, suffocating, and rotten with the stench of sweat, damp concrete, and fading illusion, and as the Soviet artillery continued to hammer the remains of Berlin above like an endless, merciless heartbeat, the men who had once spoken with unshakable confidence about a 1,000-year empire now sat hunched over trembling maps, their fingers stained with dirt and ink, staring at red arrows that no longer needed to advance because they had already arrived, and in the centre of it all, barely illuminated by flickering yellow lights, stood Adolf Hitler, his shoulders slumped, his once carefully groomed appearance unravelling, his left hand shaking violently as if the reality outside was trying to tear its way through his body, and for long seconds no one dared to speak. Not Heinrich Himmler, not Joseph Goebbels, not the remaining generals who had spent years sending millions to battle on grand promises of victory, because outside the sound of Berlin's destruction had become too real to deny. Soviet tanks grinding across streets, buildings collapsing like brittle bones, men screaming in languages they no longer bothered to understand, and then finally, barely above a whisper, the question left Hitler's lips. Is there any army left that can still reach Berlin? And the answer that came back was the end of an era, because one by one those around the table spoke truths they had avoided for days, for weeks, for years, that the 12th Army was pinned, that the 9th Army was surrounded, that communications had been severed, that the skies belonged entirely to the enemy, that there was no rescue, no counterattack, no miracle force coming from the horizon, only the slow, inevitable tightening of a circle made of steel, fire and consequence. And when those words settled into the small underground room, something inside the Nazi high command finally shattered, because for the first time since the war had begun in 1939, there was no fantasy left to hide behind, only the raw, undeniable truth that the Reich had died not in a last glorious stand, but in fear, isolation, and quiet disbelief. And Goebbels' voice trembled as he muttered that the German people must never know the depth of the collapse, that history must remember them as martyrs rather than fools. Yet even he no longer truly believed what he was saying, because the tremble in the concrete ceiling overhead reminded them that history had already crossed its final threshold, and outside the bunker, in the shattered streets of Berlin, civilians hid in basements with children clutched to their chests, soldiers with no orders fired blindly into smoke. Young boys in uniforms too large for their bodies cried as they loaded rifles with shaking hands, and in Soviet command posts only miles away, officers marked their maps with a different kind of finality as they prepared to storm the government district, unaware that beneath their boots the Nazi leadership sat in a grim, frozen silence. And at 3:30 p.m., just minutes later, as a muffled gunshot echoed through the lower chambers, a sound barely heard above the artillery but felt like an earthquake in the room. Word slowly reached the others that Hitler was dead, that the man who had dragged Europe into unimaginable darkness had taken his own life within the walls of his collapsing empire, and with that single confirmation, chaos broke loose inside the bunker. Not glorious chaos, not heroic sacrifice, but desperate, human panic, chairs scraping, boots shuffling, voices raised, some in denial, some in relief, some in raw terror of what would happen when the enemy reached them. And for the Nazi high command, this was the moment of complete reversal, the moment when the future vanished, and only the question of survival remained, because the nightmare they had created was now staring directly back at them from the footsteps of approaching soldiers. And in that suffocating underground room, surrounded by maps of lands they no longer controlled, the high command whispered not of victory, not of honour, not even of ideology, but of escape, of hiding, of destruction of evidence, of who could flee, who should stay, and who would stand trial if they lived. And one voice, cracked and barely holding together, was heard saying, "Berlin is lost, Germany is lost, this is the end." And those words, simple yet catastrophic, collapsed onto the table like a death sentence not just for a government, not just for a regime, but for a vision built on terror and violence. And as more artillery rained above them, shaking dust from the ceiling like falling ash, the Nazi high command finally realized, not through intelligence reports or enemy propaganda, but through the cold presence of reality, that Berlin had not been captured in a grand moment. It had vanished in layers of fire, sound, and inevitability. And in that realization, their final words were not powerful, not defiant, not legendary, but fragmented. Broken whispers about escape routes, false documents, stolen identities, and the haunting question of how a dream of domination had ended in an underground tomb, beneath a ruined city where no one was even listening to them anymore. May 1st, 1945, 4:40 a.m., Berlin. Above ground, the city was no longer a city but an open grave of stone and smoke, a maze of broken facades and burning streets where entire buildings had folded in on themselves like dying beasts, and yet beneath that chaos, inside the buried heart of the Führerbunker, the remaining members of the Nazi High Command gathered for what they all knew, whether they dared admit it loud or not, would be the final meeting of an empire that had built itself on fear and illusion, and the silence that filled the map room felt heavier than any bomb above, because it was not the silence of strategy, but the silence of men realizing there were no longer any moves left to play, and as General Hans Krebs adjusted his wrinkled uniform and stared at the useless communications equipment that had long since lost connection to the outside world, he cleared his throat and finally said what none of them wanted to give breath to. The Soviets are at the Brandenburg Gate, their forward troops are less than 500 meters from us. And the words hung in the air like a final verdict, because every man in that room knew exactly what that meant, that there were no more lines, no more reserves, no last-minute miracle offensives, just the slow tightening grip of an army that had already torn its way through the heart of the Reich. And Joseph Goebbels, pale, hollow-eyed, his voice stripped of the theatrical power it once commanded over millions, slumped into a chair and muttered, "So this is how it ends, not in fire, but cornered like rats." And though no one responded, the truth of that statement landed harder than any propaganda had ever demanded. While nearby, officers began feverishly burning papers, shoving files into small metal drums, lighting matches with shaking hands to erase records that could now damn them, the stench of burning ink and paper mixing with the constant dampness of concrete and despair, and somewhere deeper in the bunker, Eva Braun sat silently, brushing dust from her dress as though preparing for a dinner that would never happen, while above ground, Soviet troops methodically swept through street after street, occasionally pausing as wounded German soldiers emerged with hands raised, eyes empty, no more words left to spend on a war that had already declared them defeated, and shortly after dawn, a Soviet messenger pushed through the rubble of Wilhelmstrasse carrying a white flag, calling for unconditional surrender of the city, a message relayed down into the bunker through frightened intermediaries, and when it reached the High Command, there was no response of outrage, no speech of defiance, just a tired, broken understanding as General Krebs, now acting in what little remained of official capacity, slowly nodded and said, "There is nothing left to negotiate, we have nothing left to give." And in that moment, the concept of power that had once defined them, the ability to command, to order, to dominate, evaporated completely, leaving only frightened men pretending to be leaders, clinging to titles that no longer meant survival. And yet even in the face of absolute defeat, fragments of denial struggled to survive as one officer whispered, "Perhaps the Americans will arrive before the Russians reach us, perhaps they will treat us differently." And that thought, though desperate, revealed their fear, not of death alone, but of judgment, of what awaited them for the choices they had made, the lives they had destroyed, the horrors they had unleashed across the world. And as their thoughts spiraled toward trials and punishment, toward gallows and prison walls they had once ordered built for others, the fear in their eyes became unmistakably human, and for the first time, the mask of untouchable authority was completely stripped away. And then, as if to punctuate the end of every illusion they had ever told themselves, the ground above them shook harder than it had at any previous moment. A direct artillery strike landing mere meters above the bunker, lights flickering wildly, dust raining from the ceiling, men instinctively throwing their arms over their heads, realizing that for all their titles and declarations, they were now no more protected than the civilians huddled in broken basements above. And as the vibration settled, an eerie, profound quiet took over, interrupted only by distant Russian shouts, gunfire echoing down the hollow streets, and finally, slowly, as if each word carried the weight of an era collapsing, Goebbels spoke again, not as a minister of propaganda, but as a man looking directly into a ruined future. "History will never forgive us, even our own people will deny our names." And no one contradicted him, because outside, it was already happening. German soldiers throwing off insignia, civilians tearing down flags, entire identities erased in moments as the world prepared to pretend this nightmare had never belonged to them, and at approximately 6:15 a.m., General Krebs and a small escort moved cautiously through a wrecked entrance tunnel under a white cloth, stepping into the broken streets of Berlin towards Soviet lines to speak the unthinkable word surrender. And as he walked among shattered buildings once adorned with banners, through places where processions had once filled the air with chants and celebration, he now walked among bodies, smoke, and silence, the physical evidence of what his government had created, and when he reached the Soviet command point and spoke the words of capitulation on behalf of a regime that had already died in shame underground, the response was cold and immediate. Unconditional surrender or total annihilation. No conditions, no compromise. And as Krebs returned, carrying the weight of that final answer, the high command inside the bunker finally understood not only that Berlin had fallen, but that their story had ended with no control over how it would be remembered. And as the red Soviet banners slowly began to rise over government buildings above, casting their shadow over a city that no longer had the strength to resist, the Nazi high command sat in silence for one final time, not discussing battles or enemies, but quietly confronting the realization that everything they had built had collapsed into nothing, and the only thing left behind would be ruins, shame, and the echo of a world that would spend generations trying to understand how such darkness had ever been allowed to exist at all. May 1st, 1945, for 1:10 p.m., Berlin. By this hour, the air above the Reich Chancellery had a strange, unnatural stillness to it. Not the peaceful quiet of safety, but the exhausted silence of a storm that had already destroyed everything it touched. And inside the bunker, the last remnants of the Nazi high command drifted like shadows through narrow corridors, now lit only by emergency lamps, and the fading belief that the outside world even still existed. And as footsteps of Soviet soldiers began to echo faintly through the broken streets above, reverberating down through cracked stone and hollow tunnels, the realization began to settle into the minds of the men who had once commanded entire armies that the war, at least for them, was finished in the most final and humiliating way imaginable. Not with honor, not with triumph, not even with defiance, but with helpless waiting in an underground tomb beneath the very city that had once worshipped their words, and in the cramped map room, now barely recognizable beneath scattered papers, burned files, and overturned chairs, a small group of remaining officials gathered once more, including Martin Bormann, General Wilhelm Burgdorf, Ludwig Stumpfegger, and a handful of loyal aides, and for long moments no one spoke because none of them had anything left to say that had meaning, until finally Burgdorf broke the silence in a dry, hollow voice and murmured, "They will not negotiate, they will not forgive, there will be trials, there will be executions," and those words spread through the air like poison, because suddenly death no longer felt like a distant battlefield event. It felt like a formal, documented, cold future. Processions, testimonies, global humiliation, and as that reality started to sharpen, the High Command shifted from planning war to planning escape, to discussing stolen identities, false names, underground routes, rumors of unprotected corridors leading west, whispers about American lines, and the illusion that one enemy might spare them more than another. And yet, with every passing minute, it became painfully clear that escape was becoming as impossible as victory, because the city was now wrapped in a tightening Soviet grip, every key bridge controlled, every street littered with patrols, every path to the outside world collapsing under rubble and surveillance, and Goebbels, now broken beyond even the ability to pretend confidence, sat at a table staring endlessly at a cracked mirror, his face unrecognizable even to himself, and whispered, "Germany will curse us, the world will erase us, there will be no memory left that is not filled with hate." And for once no one tried to dress those words in ideology, because hate was the only memory their actions had earned them, and somewhere above, a red flag was being tied to a piece of broken metal in preparation for placement atop a government building that no longer governed anything. And when that knowledge made its way down into the bunker, through frightened messengers, the final illusion of authority shattered completely, because the symbol of another power was preparing to rise where the Reich emblem had once stood. And it was in that precise moment that Bormann slammed his hand onto the table and said with bitter disbelief, "So this is how it ends, buried like criminals while the world celebrates our downfall." And the irony of that statement bled through the room because criminals were exactly what history would name them, no matter how many titles or medals they had once possessed. And then, one by one, the remaining members of the Nazi High Command began to make their individual choices, some choosing flight even in hopelessness, preparing to disappear into civilian clothing and attempt escape through serving tunnels and hidden routes that resistance fighters had already compromised, others choosing poison capsules that had been distributed discreetly among them like dark blessings for the inevitable moment, and some simply sitting in silence, waiting for the boots that would soon be heard approaching their door. And as that door finally trembled under heavy external force, as foreign voices echoed clearly through the hallway instead of distant muffled shouts, the last conversation that passed between the remaining leaders of the regime was not about strategy, not about Germany, and not about their fallen leader, but about fear, about judgment, and about the question that haunted every single one of them in those final minutes, spoken softly by Stumpfegger as he stared at the ground. "Do you think the world will ever understand why we did this, or will they only remember what we became?" And no one answered, because the truth was already echoing through history as it was being written in real time above them, and as spots of red light from Soviet lanterns began to sweep the tunnel walls, as the echo of foreign boots grew louder, as weapons were lowered in surrender or raised in final defiance, the Nazi high command finally confronted the realization that power, once lost, could never be reclaimed, that ideology could not protect them, that titles meant nothing in the face of consequence, and that the world outside, which had suffered in unimaginable ways for years, would now finally speak for itself. And in that realization, some collapsed to the floor in quiet despair. Others chose silence, and a few whispered prayers they had never truly believed in before. And when the first Soviet soldier stepped into the main corridor of the Führer bunker, staring in confusion at the broken men who had once shaped the fate of millions, there was no speech, no final declaration, no dramatic last act of power, only silence, shame, and the hollow echo of history closing a chapter that should never be repeated again. May 2nd, 1945, 6:45 p.m., Berlin. The last echo of gunfire faded into the wounded air of a city that had nothing left to give as Soviet forces fully secured the government, district, their boots crunching over glass, stone, and the remnants of a world that had shattered under the weight of its own cruelty, and above the ruins of the Reichstag, where smoke still curled like a dying spirit into a darkened sky. The red flag fluttered slowly in the cold wind, not as a symbol of victory alone, but as an unmistakable signal that an entire chapter of human history had now slammed shut forever. And within the underground maze that had sheltered the Nazi high command for its final days, Soviet soldiers moved carefully, almost cautiously through the narrow corridors, their flashlights passing over maps covered in desperate markings, abandoned telephones, overturned chairs, children's drawings left behind by families who had long since fled or died. And finally they encountered the men who had once been untouchable, sitting or standing motionless, stripped of uniforms, stripped of authority, stripped even of identity. Mere human beings surrounded by the wreckage of decisions that had set the world on fire. And as those soldiers stared at them, at the tired eyes, the trembling hands, the hollow expressions of figures who had ordered the destruction of nations, there was no triumph in the moment, only a heavy, settled understanding that this was what absolute power looked like at the end, small, afraid, and completely irreversibly defeated, and word of Berlin's fall spread rapidly beyond its borders, carried not by propaganda, but by the undeniable truth of silence, where once there had been gunfire. And that night, in war rooms across the world, Allied leaders confirmed what many had dared not believe would ever fully happen. The Nazi regime had collapsed in its own capital, the symbol of its strength now reduced to a pile of rubble and names that the world would never utter with respect again. And in homes far from the front lines, families gathered around radios listening in disbelief as an announcer spoke the words, "Berlin has fallen, the war in Europe is effectively over," and in that instant a mixture of relief and grief wrapped around the globe. Relief that the nightmare had finally ended, grief for the millions who had never lived to hear those words. And yet, beneath that global moment, inside dark interrogation rooms and temporary holding cells, the surviving figures of the high command were already beginning to understand the permanence of their fate as questions rained down upon them, each question a shard of memory, each answer another step toward a reckoning that would be seen by the world, and while cameras would later capture their faces in trial, record their voices as they attempted to justify the unjustifiable, none of that could ever fully convey the moment they realized Berlin had fallen, because that realization had not come through history books or courtrooms. It had come through the vibration of the bunker walls, through the sound of approaching boots, through the unbearable silence of maps that no longer mattered, and in those final hours there were no speeches left, no ideologies spoken boldly, just fractured whispers between broken men, fragments of regret, fear, disbelief, and for some, the first glimpse of truth they had avoided for years, that power taken through violence always ends the same way, not in glory but in ruins, and years later, when historians would analyze the downfall of the Third Reich, they would speak of military strategy, supply lines, Allied coordination, Soviet advances and political collapse, but far beneath those measurable factors, hidden where microphones and cameras never reached, was a simpler, more haunting reality. That Berlin fell first in the minds of the men who had ruled it, in a silent moment when even they finally understood that the world they had forced into darkness had survived them, and as the sun rose over the broken capital the next morning, casting light across destroyed architecture, abandoned weaponry, and a city struggling to breathe again, it became clear that Berlin had not just fallen to an army, it had fallen to consequence, to justice, to the unbreakable truth that no empire built on hate can stand forever, and long after buildings were rebuilt, borders redrawn, and scars faded from the streets, the echo of that moment would remain, not as a victory cry but as a warning written across history itself that every decision carries a future, and one day even the highest command must answer to the world it tried to control.